Welcome back, welcome back. It's 5 o'clock on a Wednesday, which means it's time for Viruses and Vibes to take a deep dive into our disease of the month. Today, we have a very special one that's been popping up across American TVs the last few months. For this month, we will be looking at monkeypox. We have an astounding 4 guests from across the country that each offer a different area of expertise. For this enigma, man, I'm already getting excited talking about it. Our main objectives will stay the same. We want to understand what this disease is, where it came from, how it might affect our population, and how we're currently studying or curing it. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Oh, and a quick disclaimer, just so everyone is on the same page. For the rest of this episode, we will be referring to this infectious disease as Mpox. Although it is more commonly known to the public as monkeypox, the World Health Organization suggested a name change to Mpox in 2022 as a way to combat racist and stigmatizing language associated with the original name. Out of respect of this decision, my guest and I will only be using the term Mpox from here on out. So, we're going to get started with our first guest, who is an expert epidemiologist from Dallas, Texas. Anna, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Ashley. Thank you so much for having me on.
Why don't you get started by giving us a little bit of intro about yourself and your work with this infectious disease?
Sure, I'd love to. So I am currently working for the CDC in Atlanta, Georgia as a senior epidemiologist where I look at patterns, causes, and distributions of all types of diseases. I've never had Mpox personally, but I have been in the field during a few of the outbreaks, so I would say I know a thing or two about the disease.
Yes, and I'd love to hear that. Could you start with the basics for us and explain what Mpox is and where it came from?
Yes, definitely. So, Mpox is a double-stranded DNA virus caused by the monkeypox virus. This specific virus belongs to the Orthopoxvirus genus, which is in the Poxviridae family. Other viruses in this family include cowpox and variola. 2 known subtypes of Mpox are labeled clade 1 and clade 2, and it's important to make this distinction as the 2 clades differ by geographic location, mortality, and transmission.
Thanks for pointing that out. I think a lot of people don't recognize that there are 2 different classifications. And I'll just add that the virus was originally discovered in 1958 in Denmark, in monkeys. But it wasn't until 1970 when the first human case was recorded. The victim was a 9-month-old boy from the Democratic Republic of Congo, and it was clade 1 virus that was first detected.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that all gives us some insight into the hosts of Mpox. As mentioned, both animals and humans can be infected. The natural reservoirs, though, are thought to be rodents and other small mammals in Central and Western Africa. Some of these species include rats, squirrels, and monkeys.
That's right. Well, thank you so much, Anna, for joining us. And with that, we'll welcome our next guest to the show. And now, we'll welcome Arav to the show to learn a little bit more about the inner workings of the Mpox virus. Arav, could you start by introducing yourself to us?
Hi, yes. Thank you so much for having me, Ashley. I am currently working at a hospital in Washington, D.C. as an infectious specialist. Although Mpox outbreaks only occur every so often, I have dealt with infected patients before, so I'm pretty knowledgeable about the transmission of the disease.
Which is perfect, because I wanted you to specifically touch on how Mpox spreads and how its hosts are affected by it. Why don't you begin by describing the life cycle of the host and explain how it replicates?
Sure. So there are actually 3 stages in the life cycle of Mpox virus. which are invasion, replication, and assembly. In the invasion stage, the virus attaches to the host cell, which is usually that of a rodent, and merges with its cell membrane. During this process, the disease is released into the cytoplasm of the cell. The replication stage comes next, where the viral DNA replicates and the viral particles turn into mature viruses. In the final assembly stage, these particles officially become infectious and are released from the infected cell via a budding mechanism. The mature viruses can now repeat this process and infect other cells via transmission.
Awesome! Although the life cycle of the virus is quite complex, the transmission methods are simpler. Could you tell us a little bit more about the ways in which the infections can occur?
Yeah, so humans can be infected from animals directly via bites or scratches, but we can also be contaminated by consuming raw or undercooked meat, which is much harder to control. When human-to-human transmission occurs, it primarily happens through close contact with an infected individual. This includes skin-to-skin contact and exposure to infectious sores or scabs.
And once humans are infected, it's well understood that symptoms can vary very drastically from person to person. What are the most common symptoms and effects of the pathogen, and how a person becomes infected?
Like you said, it truly depends on the individual and many underlying factors. However, almost everyone experiences a rash with skin ulcers or blisters. This rash occurs in 5 distinct stages and can appear as sores on the mouth, face, hands, feet, and private areas. Besides a rash, the other common symptoms include fever, swollen lymph nodes, chills, headaches, muscle aches, and fatigue. These symptoms will typically go away on their own after 2 to 4 weeks, but complications can also occur. It's not uncommon for people infected with Mpox to experience a loss of vision, severe scarring, bacterial infections, and even heart and brain inflammation. Although this virus may not be extremely lethal, it can impact reproductive health and lead to potential comorbidities as well.
Thanks so much for that thorough explanation, Arav. It really helps us understand how Mpox spreads and the impact it can have on those infected. As you mentioned, while the virus itself may not be as deadly as some others, the complications it causes are definitely concerning. Now, we will transition into segment 3, where we will talk more about the pathogen itself. Our third guest is Gage, who is a scientific researcher from the central Wisconsin area. Gage has been studying the Mpox virus for several years, so he is the perfect guest for this podcast episode. Hi, Gage. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Ashley, so much for having me. There's nothing I love more than informing the public about Mpox, so I'm happy to be here.
And we'd love to hear that. Well, why don't we jump right in and have you tell us about the prevalence of the disease?
Sure. So since Mpox was first discovered in humans in 1970, there have been a few epidemics that have implications on a global scale. Mpox slowly took over in 1980, and I'll give the audience a chance to kind of guess where this might have occurred. It was Africa, following the official eradication of smallpox. Since then, Clade 1 cases of Mpox have been reported sporadically in Central and East Africa, while Clade 2 cases have been prominent in West Africa. Other than that, large epidemics occur here and there in countries all over the world. Even in 2003, a Clade 2 outbreak occurred in the United States that was eventually linked to imported wild animals in my home state, Wisconsin. For the past few decades, thousands of cases have been announced in the Democratic Republic of the Congo each year, which is where the first human case occurred.
That's some really great information. As you mentioned, that there was an outbreak in 2003, but has there been any significant activity between then and now? Or has Mpox been pretty silent for the most part?
That's a great question. Mpox, unfortunately, is still very prevalent in our society today, with the last global outbreak occurring in 2022. This one was especially significant because the virus spread to countries where it had not been seen before. There was also infections reported across the United States. Even though our technology and diagnostic skills have improved, new societal systems have allowed the disease to fester and repeatedly flare.
Wow! It's clear that despite efforts to control the virus, it has remained a significant public health issue. Let's shift some gears here and talk a little more about the pathogen itself, which may help to explain the problems with limiting the spread of the disease. Gage, since you have a lot of experience with the Mpox virus in your research lab, could you describe how the pathogen is studied?
Yes, so the pathogen can be cultured in laboratory settings via cell structures or animal models, which is very helpful at seeing the transmission. We know the virus spreads through contact to open sores, scabs, and sexual contact. That is why it is so important that when people ask me how to prevent the disease, the first thing I tell them is to be responsible with who they come into contact with. In the lab, we introduce the virus to vero cells. This is a special type of cell that lacks a very key immune protein that would normally attack a virus such as this. These cells allow the virus to multiply while not being attacked. Animal models can also allow us to understand how the virus spreads and impacts its host.
As our listeners know, we talk about animal models a lot on this show to see the disease spreading. But it's also my understanding that PCR techniques can be used to analyze genetic sequencing when Mpox is suspected in an individual.
Yes, that's exactly correct. The virus can undergo genetic mutations that lead to the emergence of new strains that are unfamiliar and require newfound attention. These mutations could ultimately affect the virus behavior and ability to infect, transmit, and survive, which makes it much more difficult to control the spread. We use PCR to view the genetic sequence so that when mutations arise, we can kind of, in a way, backtrack them and use animal models to test the new strand's qualities. The virus can also be impacted by external effectors and the host cell's behavior, which includes antiviral treatments and immune response.
Thanks so much for sharing that, Gage. It's so fascinating to hear about how your team is able to study the Mpox directly in your research lab. Now that we have a better understanding of the virus itself, we'll move on to discuss the current state of research and the impact of Mpox on today's society. And with that, I welcome our fourth and final guest to the podcast, who is a public health expert from the Boston, Massachusetts area. Cushy, thanks so much for joining us.
Of course, thank you for having me.
Why don't you start by explaining some of the broader economic and social impacts of the disease?
Sure, so the Mpox virus has significant effects, especially in regions where outbreaks are most prevalent and where the populations are most vulnerable. The spread of Mpox can disrupt the local economies by affecting production, consumption, and tourism. A specific example of this was found in the sub-Saharan Africa, where a recent outbreak scared away almost all tourists, which is devastating because of how important tourism is for the economic stability and growth of that area.
Thanks to that example, Cushy. Not only do Mpox outbreaks cause fear in a lot of people, but they also have substantial financial burdens on the healthcare systems. Can you add to that?
Yeah, so the costs add up rapidly as they go towards hospitalization, diagnosis, medications, and public health measures, and guidelines like quarantine. Recurring outbreaks like those in parts of Africa strain healthcare finances, which lead to inadequate resources and increased individual expenses. In places where Mpox is endemic, like Africa, people often do not have the resources needed to experience these types of strains.
And you've mentioned how costly these outbreaks are for the society, but what about the costs that go towards eradicating the virus?
So as far as funding goes, it varies greatly depending on the location of the outbreak and its severity. International contributions are common and come from global governments. For example, in the United States' most recent outbreak, the Global Fund provided almost $10 million to support emergency response in high transmission areas. The United States government also contributed an additional $17 million to support preparation efforts and clinical advancements like vaccines.
And what about the financial support given to underdeveloped countries?
Unfortunately, funding often falls short in these countries and in Africa specifically, which has a huge hindrance on effective responses. So this lack of funding also creates a ripple effect, limiting the ability to provide assistance to other areas in need.
Well, it certainly seems like a complex issue with financial limitations really hindering the ability to respond effectively. But as we know, research and scientific study play a crucial role in managing and controlling outbreaks. Kushi, could you share your insights on how well Mpox is studied in today's society?
So, in terms of citations in biological journals, it has been determined that 562 total sources contributed to 1278 papers relating to the Mpox virus in the last 6 years. So quite a lot of scientific research is being done daily. Additionally, there are gene sequences for Mpox in GeneBank from many of the outbreaks, which is helpful as it allows researchers to explore how a new strain compares to past strains. For example, the virus from a small outbreak in 2022 was put into the database and analyzed, which ultimately led scientists to recognize its extreme similarity to a strain involved in a 2017-18 outbreak.
That's great. Thanks, Kushi. It's encouraging to hear about the progress being made in the research of Mpox. With that, we'll take a short break before we wrap up this podcast episode. Now, before we completely wrap up today's episode, we're going to have some fun with a rapid-fire fun fact segment. All 4 of our guests will be returning to each share one quick and interesting or even unknown fact about Mpox. We'll go back to the beginning and start with Anna, and then move on from there. All right, Anna, what do you have for us?
So, my interesting fact has to do with the risk factors for infection. Mpox disproportionately affects homosexual males, children under 15 years old, people with weakened immune systems, pregnant women, and people that have a history of eczema.
Arav, you're up next.
Sure. Many people don't know this, but Mpox is still contagious even after the scabs fall off. While the disease is most contagious when the rash is active, the dried scabs can still carry infectious viral particles even after falling off and blistering.
Very interesting and good to know. Gage, why don't you tell us something that is unknown about the disease?
Sure, I'd love to do that. While the cause of emergence of the Mpox disease remains a mystery, hypothesized factors include climate change, rainforest exploitation, geopolitical and armed conflicts in diseased areas, highly mobile populations, and waning herd immunity following cessation of smallpox vaccination.
Great! And finally, Kushi.
Another unknown fact about Mpox has to do with how long immunity lasts after vaccination or after one has been infected. Currently, it is unknown, but the best way to reduce risk is to get vaccinated. There are no approved antiviral treatments for the disease, so vaccination is really critical. And if you suspect you may be infected, you should see a healthcare provider immediately.
Awesome! And with that, this episode of Virus and Vibes has concluded. A huge thank you to all of our guests for sharing their expertise today and helping us better understand the complexities of the Mpox virus. It's clear that a lot of progress has been made, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. For those who have tuned in, it's important to stay well informed and engaged in current conversations surrounding public health. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe and share it with others. And with that, we'll see you next Wednesday at 5 o'clock.